Greetings and welcome to the Peace Operations Training Institute's webinar series. We are committed to bringing essential, practical knowledge to military personnel, police, and civilians working toward peace worldwide. To explore all the e-learning training programs offered by the Peace Operations Training Institute, you are invited to view our website at www.peaceopstraining.org. The Peace Operations Training Institute would like to thank the nations and the ministries of foreign affairs that provide the support so essential for the success of our webinars and all the programs we offer. These are Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. In this webinar, Dr. Harvey Langholtz, the Executive Director of the Peace Operations Training Institute, interviews Colonel Festus Aboagye, Army of Ghana, retired, and currently with the Institute for Security Studies. This interview was conducted at the annual meeting of the International Association of Peacekeeping Training Centers, held September 2012 in Helsinki, Finland.
Greetings. I'm Harvey Langholtz, the Executive Director of the Peace Operations Training Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this installment of our webinar series, coming from Helsinki, Finland, where I'm attending the annual meeting of the International Association of Peacekeeping Training Centers, along with some of the most knowledgeable and distinguished people in the field of peacekeeping training. And I'm very pleased to have with me this afternoon Colonel Festus Aboagye. He is a retired colonel from the Army of Ghana, and he is currently at the Institute for Security Studies, where he is in their conflict management and peace building section and runs the Training for Peace project. So Festus, you and I have been to many of these annual conventions together. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you first, please, to tell our students and viewers a little bit about what goes on at ISS and what your job is there.
Now, the Institute for Security Studies, or ISS for short, is an African regional policy think tank in the field of applied politics in a wide range of areas around issues of human security. So we have programs that deal with terrorism, counterterrorism, governance, corruption, peacekeeping, conflict management, issues around women, peace and security, climate change, and so on and so forth. So the Training for Peace program, which is a project that is funded by the Norwegian government, is only one of a number of programs and projects that the ISS runs. And the ISS has offices until recently in Cape Town, but headquartered in Pretoria of South Africa, and then in Nairobi of Kenya, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and not so recently, but relatively recently, in Dakar, Senegal.
Good, thank you. Well, with that introduction, let me turn to some questions. We have several questions submitted by students. In fact, we have many questions. I'm not going to be able to pose all of them to you. But I've selected some, and I look forward to your answers. So I'll get to the first one. First one is from Mugira Charles, and writes, "Dear Sir, I applaud all efforts of the peace training centers have put into training of prospective peacekeepers to ensure maximum maintenance of international peace and security. However, I always fail to interlink training to deployment. What measures are there within training centers to ensure the trained personnel are deployed to practice what they have attained during their training at various levels in peacekeeping operations all over the world? This would not only promote good peacekeeping practices, but would enhance faster conflict resolutions and better treatment of all stakeholders and victims of the conflicts."
Thanks, Charles. I think that is a very interesting question, and one that has been bugging the peacekeeping or peace support operations community for a while. Now, the reality is this, that those who provide training, like POTI, like ISS and many other institutions that are currently attending the 18th conference of the IAPTC are only service providers. They're not the end users of the products of their efforts. The end users are like the UN, particularly the DPKO, maybe the African Union, and such other regional organizations like NATO and so on and so forth. So there is very little prerogatives or prerogative of the training providers, changing their roles to become the end users. What they could do, and I think some of them have been doing, is to roster them, to put them on a kind of database that I believe POTI is doing. And from time to time, if and when approached by any of the end users like the UN system or the African Union, to put forward a list of candidates that they would highly recommend. Or sometimes if they are approached specifically to suggest names and so on. So I think it's a field that doesn't augur well for the training providers to impose on the end users whom they should recruit for PSO and peacekeeping deployment. Maybe it's an issue that in future could be taken up, as indeed I think it has been already, in such conferences as the IAPTC, to see how best the investments into training personnel of all categories for PSO peacekeeping could be maximized. But linked to this is also the idea that in the field of peacekeeping, even by the UN as well as PSO by regional organizations, you're dealing with member states as the actors. And member states reserve the prerogative to select the personnel that they deploy. So once you do your job, like Charles, preparing yourself, you just keep hoping and praying that sometime in the future, it may be short, it may be long, a government or an institution or an organization may approach you and request for your services for deployment. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I've tried to explain, the circumstances around, the use of personnel who are trained for deployment.
Thanks. Yeah, it's complicated. And this next question comes from Dr. Willie S. Lebor of the Society for Peace Studies and Practice. And this came in the list among all other students and others. But actually, I had the pleasure of attending a conference last year sponsored by the Society for Peace Studies and Practice. And I met this individual. It was an excellent conference held in Janji, Nigeria. But here's the question. Thanks for this information. Peacekeeping is becoming more dangerous the world over. We are now witnessing a surge in enemy attacks on peacekeeping troops, especially in Afghanistan and other troubled spots in the world. Is there anything wrong with the concept? Do you feel that the rules of engagement require fine-tuning?
Well, thank you. This is from Dr. Willie.
That's right.
Yeah, I've looked at your question, and first of all, I wish to let us agree that we should make a distinction between UN peacekeeping and peace support operations undertaken by NATO and other coalitions of willing states. But there is a technical difference between the two. So let me address your question in terms of UN peacekeeping and not, or first of all, in terms of PSO by regional organizations. Now, PSO, like the coalition led by the states, USA in Afghanistan, is close to war fighting. That mandate requires them to use a higher threshold of force in order to achieve the objectives for which the deployment took place. And remember also, probably I don't even need to remind you, that they're fighting against forces that are determined to get rid of all foreign presence in those countries, and who have not signed any peace agreement, and therefore are not bound by any rules of engagement or do not respect the status of force that relates to the coalition in Afghanistan. So in that field, everything goes. And that is why you have this repeated roadside bombs and other bombings and terrorist attacks, if I may use that word, against the coalition forces. Yes, there are fatalities in UN peacekeeping, but in comparison with PSO, you see that fatalities in peacekeeping environments, at least against the peacekeepers, is far lower than that of PSO, because the UN deploys only on the basis of some form of agreement. It could be a ceasefire, cessation of hostilities agreement, it could be a comprehensive peace agreement and that kind. And therefore, there are a number of parties to the conflict that agree to the presence of the UN. So, in short, it is the nature of the intervention that does not require any agreement on the part of any of the parties to intervene. And therefore, that intervention accepts that higher level of casualties or fatalities. To address that, then you need to defeat or neutralize the forces that inflict those casualties on the intervention forces. But in the process, the intervention force itself would also, suffer some casualties, as we see in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which I've already mentioned.
Yes, thank you. And I completely agree. There is sometimes a very vague line between peacekeeping and war fighting.
That's right.
And we certainly respect those who put forward that service and suffer those losses. Here is the next question, which comes to us from Helal Badri, police from Bangladesh. And this police officer from Bangladesh asked the following question. What might be the best approach to police reforms in a country like South Sudan that is plunging deep into regional, ethnic, and political conflicts and heading towards confusion and uncertainty, and where police do not have specific jurisdiction, education, and adequate professional training?
Well, thanks, Hila. Shukran. I think, once again, this is also a very valid question. Now, with regards to South Sudan, and in terms of police reforms, you need to go back to the Security Council resolution that established the UN mission in South Sudan. I cannot give you the number offhand, but the mandate of the UNMISS 2S is largely to assist, to advise, to support in the areas of nation building and security support and so on. So the UN has not assigned to itself the absolute authority to reform the security services or security forces of South Sudan. And therefore, the initiative, the willingness to reform these forces is one that rests more with the government of the Republic of South Sudan than the UN, whose role primarily is to assist and support where necessary, including giving advice and so on and so forth. The other side of the reforms in South Sudan, as I was privileged to have been there in the latter part of March this year, is that the security situation in South Sudan is still very unsettled. First of all, you have the interstate war between South Sudan and Sudan. Then internally within South Sudan, you also have these ethnic tensions between the Dinkas, and the Meles and so on and so forth. That has thrown some amount of confusion into the reform of, the security sector. Again, the reality is that the reform of the police in particular in South Sudan has been one that has largely involved taking the members of the former SPLA, in terms of those who fought against Khartoum, and putting them into uniforms in the South Sudanese police without sufficient, and I want to qualify, sufficient training and education to change their mindsets and so on. So all said and done, I think we need to give time, a bit of time for South Sudan to increasingly refine the processes and the efforts that are put into reforming the police in particular and the security sector in general. Again, one of the things that I learned in South Sudan is that yes, there is a civilian government, but the civilian government is largely composed of and by the generals who used to be the leaders of the SPLA. So in terms of classical civil authority, you still have a bit of military influences within the government of South Sudan. And that kind of dynamic also doesn't help the cause of South Sudan. I think the critical factor that would augur well for the reform of the police and the security sector is first of all peace between the North and the South. If there can be peace between the North and the South, then the focus of the government of Juba will be domestic, will be internal, to try and create a congenial environment for civilian rule. But given the tensions between Khartoum and Juba, I think that is something that we can hope for in the future. I'm aware that there are a number of countries that are willing and a number of agencies and organizations to engage with the government of Juba to reform the security sector. But given some of the factors that I've mentioned, without even talking about corruption, which has reared its head, in the governance of the country, I think the reform of the police is something that we need to wait for. I could talk about the role of the UNMISS in reforming the police, but basically this reduces to a bit of training. It's not comprehensive enough because the UNMISS hasn't got the resources to actually undertake a comprehensive reform of the South Sudanese police. So let's keep our fingers crossed and let's hope that in a matter of a few years, the government would demonstrate sufficient political will to try and overcome all the tensions between the different ethnic groups, resolve its tensions with the government of Khartoum, and then be able to reform the entire security sector and not the police alone. Because I'm also aware that the corrections side of the rule of law equation is as much in danger, if not worse danger, than even the police.
Well, I appreciate that. It is an interesting question. I agree with you. It needs police, anti-corruption, and a decrease of tension between Sudan and South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, speaking of Sudan, here's the final question. And this is from Colonel Aboagye of Senegal. And he writes, I was a team site commander in Sudan in 2011, and before that an observer in Rwanda during the genocide in Unimir in 1994, and on the peacekeeping force with Lebanon in UNIFIL in 1982 through 1983. Based on those dramatic experiences, it appears to me that the question of protection of civilians is one of the most difficult missions undertaken by field commanders. If at a strategic and operational level, meaning battalion and above, plans are designed to protect civilians, it is to note that at the tactical level, meaning company and team site, the objective does not meet the means. The question is how we can better protect civilians by being on the spot when events are unfolding and not after scores of people have already been killed or forced to flee away from their homes while peacekeepers resort to filling in reports to account for the event.
Thanks again for the question, but I think somehow the answer to your question is in the text that you framed. You do suggest, if I have understood your question correctly, that deploying the military forces, especially who have the capabilities to provide physical security, down below the company level would invariably entail insecurity to the military component itself. In other words, if the UN, for that matter MONUSCO, was to adopt a concept of operations that included the deployment of platoon posts, the platoons might be in such numbers and strength that they could easily be overpowered by some of the negative forces that you and I are aware of in the East. So that is one of the dilemmas that is imposed upon MONUSCO by the sheer size of DRC and the poor communications in terms of road access and maybe rail access and so on. So the UN has to ensure force protection, and one way of doing that is to not deploy below company standard. But that then also brings the dilemma that you've highlighted, that you then are not able to dominate in sufficient, to a sufficient degree, the terrain that we're talking about. I would want us to give the benefit of the doubt to MONUSCO that any deployment or concept of operations that devolves on company-sized forces ensures force protection that invariably might not be able to offer foolproof protection to the civilians, but at least keeps the force still intact to be able to offer protection here and there. Now, given that that is the situation, in what other ways could the UN probably, and for that matter MONUSCO, be able to accomplish its civilian protection mandate? If you start from the strategic level, and if you accept the truth or truths in the reports that have been coming from the UN and Human Rights Watch, for instance, then strategically, the international community needs to put pressure on those neighboring countries that are the sponsors of those proxy rebel groups like the M23, which metamorphosed from an earlier rebel group, in order for those countries to rein in the support that they give to those rebel groups, as well as put pressure on them, not to undertake operations that endanger civilian security. That, I think, is one dimension. The other dimension is that even if natural resources are not the root causes of the conflict in the DRC, especially the East, there is some affinity between natural resources that provide the means for certain groups, whether rebel, whether freelance, whether criminals, whatever, as well as commercial interests, to exploit the natural resources of the East and fuel the conflict. There has to be some mechanisms and some strategies to try and cut the link between those that exploit these natural resources and therefore fuel the conflict. All said and done, like the case of South Sudan, the mandate of MONUSCO is one that largely emphasizes support to the government in Kinshasa. So building government capacity is another strategy, but building the capacity of the government in Kinshasa is also a long-term endeavor. It's not something that can take place as easily and as quickly as we would want to. Attempts have been made in the past, for instance, for MONUC formally to conduct joint operations with the FDLR or FARDC, and we know the outcome of that. That given the disparities in the levels of professionalism and the logistics and so on and so forth between the FARDC on the one hand and MONUC on the other, those operations could not achieve their objectives. Again, you have FARDC undertaking certain violations of human rights, which then become an indictment on the UN that has to abide by international law. And therefore, MONUSCO has found it a bit difficult to maximize its efforts in conjunction with, as well as in support of the government of the DRC, to protect civilians. I'm not sure these answers actually are good answers to the issue of protection of civilians, but they are the dynamics that affect protection of civilians. Another lesson that I think has come out hitherto, especially in terms of the DRC, is that protection of civilians is not only about the physical protection, it's also about investigations and reporting, and then bringing people to trial or ensuring accountability. Now, these other aspects of protection of civilians are not a function of the military. They are the function of other components of the mission, as well as those that are not even members of the mission. In other words, even where the UN has had, MONUSCO has had military presence, there might not have been any or sufficient human rights investigators who should be on the ground in order for the military to provide them with a cover for them to investigate the violations of human rights. But I believe these lessons have also helped MONUSCO to learn the right lessons in order to improve upon its concept of operations, make it a bit more functionally integrated to bring together the different competencies of the different civilian, military, and police components to be able to do the job. Again, we need to wait for a while to see the culmination of all of these efforts, both strategic, operational, as well as tactical, before we can see some improvements concretely in the area of protection of civilians.
Thank you. That's the final question we have time for. I want to thank you very much. I always appreciate your good interventions at the conference here and the excellent job you've done answering these questions. So thank you very much. And to our students and other viewers worldwide, thank you for the questions you have posed. We're pleased to provide these. We're pleased to provide these webinars to serve the broader peacekeeping training community. So my name is Harvey Langholtz, the Executive Director of the Peace Operations Training Institute. Thank you for participating in this webinar series.
Thank you for viewing this webinar. We are pleased to bring this webinar to you, and we invite you to view our website to see all the programs and courses we offer. If you would like to view the archived version of this webinar or any of our previous webinars, please visit www.peaceopstraining.org/webinars. They are also available on our YouTube channel. We thank our students worldwide serving on peacekeeping missions. The Peace Operations Training Institute is dedicated to serving you.